In today's segment of Under the Apple Tree with Bob Kenny, I spent quality time with Greg Hall, the founder of Virtue Cider from Fennville, Michigan. I hope you enjoy the interview, like the channel, and subscribe.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us again for the next edition of Under the Apple Tree with Bob Kenny. Today my guest is someone you may recognize, has been around the industry for a lot of years. He is not only the founder of Virtue Cider, but you all may recognize him as the creator of Bourbon County Stout as well. But today we're going to concentrate on the cider side. And my guest is Greg Hall, and we are sitting today, wonderful outside day at Virtue Cider up in Fennville, Michigan. Greg, thanks for your time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to sit and talk cider with you today.
Bob, this is a pleasure for me. Really happy that you're on this course now, teaching everybody about all the ciders in the country, because there's a lot of great ones.
As we sit here, we're sitting on what, over 40 acres?
Yeah, 48 acres.
Okay. But it didn't start here, did it?
Well, no, it started in Chicago. We had a little office space on Roscoe Street in Roscoe Village. We kind of founded Virtue and looked for a farm up here. But the origins of Virtue really go back even further to 23 years ago, year 2000. Right about this time of year when the annual Craft Brewers Conference, which floats around every year, was in San Diego that year. So I had a budget to take brewers from Goose Island out to CBC. Found out it was cheaper to get a flight to London than San Diego. So we instead went over to England to visit breweries. And lo and behold, on this trip, we ran into a cider festival at a pub, and it just blew us all away. We tried all these that were barrel-aged and sharp and tart, and some had all kinds of tannin, most were unfiltered. We were just blown away. We had no idea you could have all that character in a cider. Yeah, cool. So thank you to the pub in New York.
So that obviously you brought that back, started there. When did you buy this property?
So we bought this property in 2012.
And you started with one cider barn, right?
Yeah, we built Cider House 1 in 2012. Did everything out of there in the first year. Built Cider House 2 in 2013. That's where we have our cellar. So now Cider House 1 is our press house. Press the apples in there, then move it over to Cider House 2 in the cellar, which is a true cellar. It's about 20 feet below grade. So you walk in and it looks just like Cider House 1 from outside, but you walk in and it goes down 20 feet. And all the tanks are underground. And it's just one floor, so there's a lot of space above them. But that way the earth keeps the tanks and thus the cider nice and cool.
And now it's Cider House 3.
Cider House 3 as well, and that is our barrel house. So we moved all our barrels into there, and then we keep our finished product in there too.
Which are your wind barrels?
Yes, so we have a pretty good assortment of wooden vessels. We've got the three newest are fooders, and then we have a range of bourbon barrels, which we get from Kentucky, and then we have the largest range by far is white wine barrels, French oak from France. So we like to get the used barrels, and we like to get them from France because they not only are the barrels themselves great, but the microflora from France that remains resident in there is interesting, and it gives us just extra layers of complexity.
Is it hard to get them, and knowing that everybody's reaching for used barrels these days?
Not hard, as long as you're ready to check.
Always.
That's the way it goes, right? Yeah, we take good care of our barrels, so once we started out and we had a good base, we get some every year, but we don't need to recycle them. Like, for instance, a bourbon producer uses their barrels only once. A bourbon barrel gets used and it goes from like 10 years of bourbon in there to 10 plus years of scotch in there. Our friend Tom Oliver buys them for cider over in Herefordshire.
Each one of those, as you mentioned, imparts something into the cider, right, as opposed to coming out of stainless. And what percentage of your cider winds up in aging in those barrels?
Almost all of it does. We make some ciders that we call our orchard series. So like the Wincroft here, this is an estate hard cider from Wincroft, which is a winery actually down the road.
Okay.
But they've also got some orchards on the estate. So we get apples from them. What we do is we take those apples, press them, and ferment it. And we don't add anything. We don't add yeast. It's the yeast from the estate too. Okay. We don't put it in barrel. So all we're getting is a taste of the apples from this estate. And we do it for several other farms too. Okay.
And is that a single apple? Or
No, it's just everything they've got.
on their farm?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's okay.
You described this as a true farmhouse cidery. What does that mean?
Back when I was a brewer and I did research on brewing, I went through Siebel, I went through brewing school, but I found really the most interesting way to learn is go visit breweries. Because nobody does it the same. Everybody does it a little bit differently. And you pick up different things around the way from everybody. They all do it a little differently. And it's the same thing in England with cider. Everybody does it a little differently. So there are some cider classes, but they're generally like 1 week, which is great. It's better than not having it. Not the big in-depth thing. So what I did is I went over to England and France and visited cider makers and tried to identify a mentor in each country that could give me kind of the go-to person for when I had questions. So Tom Oliver was that guy in England, still is. This past weekend was the Royal Bath and West show, which is the big cider show in England. It's glorious. And then you go over there and you visit 20 cider makers and they do it 20 different ways.
Yeah.
So that's the best way to learn about making cider is visiting cider makers.
And a lot of them are on farms, right? And we talked about the barrels. I remember visiting a really small farm in Normandy that the barrel was 100 years old.
I've seen them from the early 18th century, still in use in Normandy.
And your barns, cider barns, are in the vein of what you would see in Normandy, right? The traditional look?
Yeah, that's the traditional look that we're going for. We wanted to provide our guests with an opportunity to go to, just by getting in the car and driving a couple hours.
Cool. Now, before we talk about this wonderful variety of ciders, if somebody comes here, what's the goal for them? What's your goal for people coming to Virtue Cider? Because I know you've had great success over the last couple of years getting people to visit, sit, stay, there's music, there's food. What's the overall goal of Virtue Cider?
Well, I think if you go back over the last 50 years in adult beverage in America, go back to the early 70s and before, people drank stuff they didn't really know anything about it. There was beer, there was wine, there was spirits. What really changed things was really first wine, particularly Napa and Sonoma, where you had wineries that were destinations. So the drinker could go out and visit, just as I did, and learn, and then have a much greater understanding of what's going on and how passionate the producers are, and see the process actually happening, see the grapes growing in field. So really, the wine revolution happened first. After that, craft beer got its start, and I think brew pubs really kind of changed the way people thought about beer, because they got to go and meet the maker in their neighborhood, in their hometown, smell the beer being brewed in the brew house, smell that wonderful wort aroma coming off there, and get a tour and a tasting straight from the tank, and all these different varieties of beers. That changed the way beer was perceived in America. And then, even with spirits, as the tourism in Kentucky, the Bourbon Trail really kind of grew into a big destination. Now, all of a sudden, instead of there being Jim Beam and Jack Daniels at every bar for whiskeys, now there's like 50.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do that with cider? We need the infrastructure that wine, craft beer, bourbon have had before us. And that is a place to go to learn about it. And then frankly, somebody like you to get on the internet and tell everybody about it.
Cool. And this is a family destination, right? I mean, there are animals, there's trails, there's obviously the tables and great ciders.
Yeah, we want this to be a comfortable place for anyone to come. So if you want to come here, you've got a beach vacation in Michigan, and you want to come up here on a overcast day, bring the family, great. If you're like, yeah, cider's interesting, but I just want to have a nice place to go and relax with my family, great. If you are an accountant, we get a lot of bars and restaurants, Chicago and Detroit and Louisville and points all over that are touring breweries and wineries of Michigan, and they stop by and they're like, oh man, I had no idea you guys were so developed and you had all these different ciders. We get a ton of that, and that's a great way to tell our story. We think the best way to tell the story of cider in general and Virtue in particular is coming right here.
One of the questions I had was, how do we educate people? I mean, cider's what, 1% of the total alcohol being consumed in the country, and what do you guys do to educate? And obviously that's one part of it. Is there more that you bring to the table to help people understand what cider's about?
I think that's the key, getting people to the source. Because it has worked with other spirits and forms of alcohol so well in the last 50 years. Coming here, everyone's familiar with apples, so we're kind of ahead of the game a little bit there, because you think about, you and I were selling beer in the 80s and 90s, nobody knew what hops were. Wholesalers didn't know what hops were. I remember when you and I went out to Nebraska the first time. Remember that?
I do.
And we were talking about hops, and they're like, what are hops? But everybody knows what an apple is, so we got a good head start there. One of the questions we get a lot, Bob, is people say, what kind of apples do you use? And they're expecting me to say apples they're familiar with. Sure. That they buy at the Meijer, the Kroger, the Jewel, Whole Foods. That's not the answer they get. The answer they get is Michigan apples. And they're like, wait, is there a kind of apple called Michigan? Like, no, it's apples grown in Michigan. That's what we use. And they're like, but aren't there a lot? I'm like, exactly. That's the point. So people are used to, wine, for instance, where the Americans kind of, the French and the Italians really start off by describing the wine by where it was from, which was very smart. I don't think they did it on purpose. Maybe they did, but great branding, because if you want Bordeaux, it only comes from Bordeaux.
Right.
But then you go out to California and they said, okay, we can't make Bordeaux, so we're just going to call it by the grape, Cabernet Sauvignon, which they thought was pretty clever. Except now you can get Cabernet Sauvignon from, about 60 countries in the world? With ciders, most of the time, we like to make ciders with a blend of apples, because the blends just give you more of the different components, aroma, acid, tannin, all those different things, sugar, obviously. So a blend, we think, makes the best cider. We do, though, make a lot of more single varietal cider. And I think where those are cool is when people get to understand that different apples taste different. Sure. We've got several on the table right here. Roxbury Russet, this is a beautiful pale apple. A little bit of tannin in there, nice. Baldwin, another kind of heritage apple. You see a lot grown in Michigan, although not nearly as much as there used to be. They've taken some out. And then, of course, probably not just our favorite, but a lot of people's favorite, Dabinet. Dabinet's probably the most popular English apple in England. A lot of producers make a single varietal Dabinet, but it's not their big seller. But a lot of the big sellers have a lot of Dabinet in there, because Dabinet has wonderful apple aroma and a very rich flavor, and has a good amount of tannin, which we need for that structure. People think of tannin in wines. It's the same thing in cider, but it comes not from the skin, but from the overall, the fruit itself.
Well, first off, the apples, a lot of the apples that you guys use in cider would never make it to the store, right? They're ugly.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But they deliver flavor.
Ugly fruit makes beautiful cider.
Yeah. That's one. Secondly, the process is exactly the same, whether it's multiple styles of apples versus a single apple, correct?
Pretty much, yeah. We get our fruit in. It'll always come in those big apple crates, which is the size of like a pallet that you put kegs or grocery goods or anything you ship on a pallet, but it's got sides on it. So that holds 40 bushels.
What's that in pounds, like 800 pounds?
Yeah, well, it's, the thing is a bushel is by volume, not by weight. So roughly 800 pounds, we do weigh them, and we'll get some in the low 700s, we'll get some in the mid 800s.
Okay.
It's something you gotta used to in cider, is that you don't have the kind of consistency that you have in beer. When you're a brewery and you order your malt, you get bags of malt that are 50 pounds, and guess how much they weigh?
Over the course of the year, how many pounds of apples do you guys crush? And you crush everything here, right?
Most of the stuff that we use is pressed here. In the past, we've used a lot of juice as well.
Okay.
When we were doing a lot of six-pack cider, just to keep up.
Yep. And it's all Michigan apples, though, either way.
But it's all Michigan apples,
Okay.
yes.
And how many pounds would you guess that you crush, do you think?
Last year did about 500,000 pounds. I think our peak, we did about 2 million pounds.
Okay. A lot of apples. No problem getting them?
No, we're far less than 1% of the Michigan apple market.
Okay.
Michigan is the third biggest apple producer in the country. Sometimes second. Washington is by far the most. And then it's New York and Michigan. So the top three is the vast majority. Almost every state grows some apples.
Yeah, just quality.
Yeah.
The difference.
As far as the volume, most of it comes from the big three.
Out in front of your property here, you've got an orchard.
Yeah, we have probably a little more than 3 acres planted right now of mixed fruit. So we've got a lot of Arkansas Black. We've got some Cox Orange Pippin, which do terribly well in this. I think we got maybe 2 or 3 trees left and don't get a lot of fruit out of them. And then we've got a lot of other stuff that we're planting more every year, and we're planting more cider varieties. The goal is not to produce all our fruit. The reason we came here is because there's already fruit here.
Sure.
You've got people like Overiser, which is another farm about 5 miles from here. They've been farming since, I think, something like 1852 or 1863.
Okay.
They've been growing fruit that we make cider with.
Yeah.
Longer than DuPont's been growing fruit in Normandy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I think it's thrilling to me that we can work with these family farms, and we want to work with family farms. That's one of the things that's real important about cider making is, if you go back 50 years ago, there were about 4,000 family farms growing apples in Michigan. Now we're down under 1,000. I don't really want that number to get lower. I want that number to stabilize and then maybe go back up.
If you're crushing a couple, a million pounds of apples, hopefully that's providing work and an economy for those farmers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Overisers, I think, are in their 6th generation now.
Wow, that's cool.
So it's important to be able to pass farming down to another generation and have it be not just a commodity product that you've got to, hope for the best, for everything to go right, to make pennies a pound. We're willing to pay more because we want specific apple varieties, and we're willing to pay more for them, as well as paying market rate for almost everything they grow.
And it's not just apples you're buying from these farmers. I know there's cherries, blueberries, other fruits that are coming from local farmers into these ciders, right?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is the creek cider we make. That is made with a very special type of cherry called Charbeek. Now Charbeek, if you've ever had a lambic Belgian sour beer that's made with cherries, they call that usually a creek, which is the Flemish or Dutch word for cherry. The creek beers are made with a very specific kind of cherry, which is called Charbeek. Charbeek is actually a neighborhood in northeast Brussels. That's where these tiny little cherries come from, that are unique because they are so full of acid, very, very tart, and they've got some tannin, and they just burst with flavor, but it's really intense. They're not good eating cherries, but they're great for making beer because they're so intense. You don't need it quite as many, and they're unlike anything else. We actually brought them over to States when I was at Goose Island. When you were at Goose Island too, we started making a creek beer there we called Madame Rose, which R.I.P. Madame Rose just left us this year, I think 98 years old. She was at the Leafman's Brewery, which is Lambic, but they make East Flanders, Oud Bruin ale, Leafman's which is one of the great, very unique beers of Belgium. I mean, there's really nobody else that makes that beer, and she actually saved the brewery when the Leafman family, old man Leafman, left it to his kids, and his kids were dentists and lawyers, and they didn't know anything to do with the beer business. So she ended up keeping it alive. Okay. So she kept this whole creek style of Oud Bruin alive, bless her for that, with Charbique cherries. My friend Peter Klein is a farmer who's up here. He lives in Chicago though, and he said, Greg, when are you going to use my fruit in a beer at Goose Island? And I said, well, we don't do a lot of fruit beers. He's like, what about cherries? I got all these wonderful cherries. I'm like, what kind do you have? And he rattled off 3 or 4 different varieties. I'm like, you don't have the kind I want. He's like, what do you want? I said, Charbique. He said, I've never heard of that. He's like, you wouldn't, though, because they only grow them in Belgium in a small area. They use them for Belgian-style creek beer. 2 years later, he gives me a call, and he says, hey, how many of those cherry trees do you want? And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, those special Belgian cherries. I said, Charbique? He's like, that's it. I'm like, oh, awesome, you can get them? He's like, yes. I'm like, well, let me think about it. He's like, no, I've got on my landline, I've got a call open right now to a broker who can put those on a load coming to the U.S., but I need to know right now. So I said, 50. So we bought 50 trees. Of course, they should have said 500 or 5,000. Sure. Yeah. But still, well, we got 50 trees. Okay. So we brought them over, he put them in. A couple died, a few died the first year. Didn't make it, but I think he's still got like somewhere in the mid-30s, 35, 36, 37 trees going. We used those cherries first time in 2009 or 2010 to make Madame Rose at Goose Island. And then, of course, a year later, 2011 was my last year, and I left Goose Island. They kept making Madame Rose for a couple of years, but then they stopped. And then Peter's like, okay, I brought these trees over for you, and nobody wants them. What am I going to do with them? You know, will you buy them at your new cider farm? I'm like, absolutely, we'll buy all of them. So not only do we buy all of them, but now we bring our cider makers over every year, and we actually harvest them. So again, that's the kind of thing that you can come and experience here at Virtue, and you can come and see if you're lucky enough to be here and be either the last week of June or the first couple weeks of July. We'll be harvesting those cherries, and you can see those cherries, and we'll put them in totes, put the cider on top of the cherry, and then put it in a barrel and age it for a year.
How long does it sit? A year? Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. No, that's cool. Those are the great stories. Those are the great things I think that cider makers are doing, especially with these kind, which is really what I want to talk about now. Let's talk cider. How many different styles do you think you create over the course of a year?
I think our top was 2021. I think we made like 61 different ciders. Wow. Crazy. I might be wrong on that.
Okay.
Huge amount.
Yeah.
That was, of course, during the pandemic, when everything kind of slowed down and we didn't have as much traffic here in 2020 and 2000, so we were able to spend a lot of time doing a lot of really small batch stuff.
Okay.
So most of those are very, very small batches.
Was those only sold primarily here on the property?
Almost all of them are only sold here. And then we also sell them through our website. So you can get them through e-commerce at virtuecider.com. That's virtuecider.com.
Yeah, no, that's great, because I'm a member of the society, and 3 or 4 times a year, there's like 4 bottles show up at the house, which is awesome. Not all cider is carbonated, right? There are things called
Absolutely. Absolutely.
which I'm not sure a lot of people know about.
Well, if you think of cider as being like wine except made from apples, we actually like to say wine is like cider made from grapes. Because whether you believe in, the good book or just science, apples have been around a long time, and they were kind of first. There's a good chance that humans were fermenting apples about the same time they started fermenting grapes, whether it was the Garden of Eden or Kazakhstan or wherever. When you ferment a cider or wine, CO2 is produced, but if it's in an open container, it just dissipates into the atmosphere. So just like everybody, when they think of wine, they typically think of still wine. They don't think of it as still wine,
Right.
they think of it as wine.
Yeah.
And then the alternative is sparkling wine. Cider is kind of usually sparkling, occasionally still. But if you go over to England, there's a lot more still cider, especially in the farmhouse practices.
And those are going to be dry, right? More or less?
Not always,
Oh,
not
okay.
always. If you go over to England, you'll find that a lot of the farmhouse producers, and when you asked me this question, I didn't give you a good answer. I gave you a really long answer, but it wasn't an answer. Farmhouse ciders, when I went over there, I found that they had basically three things in common. Number one, they use local fruit. They either grow it themselves or they buy it from the neighbors. That's number one. Number two, they age in a barrel.
Wooden barrel.
A wooden barrel.
Yeah.
And that's because generations ago, that's what you could get. You basically buy used wine barrels from their cousins in the South or from a wine merchant. And you could use barrels because that was cheaper than making it yourself or buying a new barrel. The wineries put their grape juice into a barrel, and then it would become wine. The cider makers would put their apple juice into a barrel, and then it would become cider.
Yeah. Okay.
Through fermentation, whether that's by adding yeast or the natural yeast that comes in on the fruit. The number one, local fruit. Number two, barrels. Number three, it's made on a farm. Because the ingredients of beer, number one is water. The other ingredients, barley malt and hops. Barley malt might be like 5% of the product. With apples and with grapes, that's 100% of the product. So when you're making cider, like with beer, you mix water and malt together and get that extract out. That's the brewing part. So beer, like coffee and tea, is brewed. Cider isn't brewed. Cider is made from squishing the apples, just like with wine, getting the juice out, and then taking that juice, and that's your liquid, and fermenting it. So in that way, it's much, much more like winemaking than it is like brewing. There's thus a major advantage to be at a farm. Now, you can still be in the city. Our mutual friend, Michelle Floyd, and there's several other outstanding city-based cider makers. So, there's different ways to make cider. You can do it with concentrate, you can do it with juice, you can do it with the apples. We make most of ours straight with the apples, but it all comes from the apple.
I'm led to believe, rightly or wrongly, in a bottle, cider will stay better than it will in a can.
That's true.
Okay.
You've got wine and you've got cider, you've got beer. Now beer, the trend now is to put it in a can. And one of the reasons for that is because beer you always want to drink fresh, or you usually want to drink fresh. And what gets in the way when it isn't fresh is oxidation. And hops in particular, when hops oxidate in a beer, you lose that fresh hop aroma and flavor, and you get more of a kind of a papery, skunky character, which is not pleasant to most people. Wines also can oxidize. Ciders can oxidize. One of the differences, though, is when you put wine or cider or beer, for that matter, or spirits in a barrel, while they hold the liquid, air can pass through, oxygen can pass through. So when you age it in a barrel, you're kind of pre-oxidizing. What that does is it kind of makes it a lot more stable. because you don't have to worry about oxidation because it's already oxidated.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with beer, most beers aren't aged in barrels. Most beers are going straight from a stainless fermenter through the packaging line right into the package, and you want to drink it, as close to the source and as fresh as you can. If it's bottle conditioned, it'll last a little longer. If it's barrel aged, it'll last a little longer, quite a bit longer. The best case for most beers is to drink fresh, because when you put it in a can, you protect from light. But the can, most people don't realize that an aluminum can, there's a liner in it. Gives the beer a little bit more protection, or the water, or the soda pop, or whatever you put in the can. The liner, though, doesn't react super well to acid. Cider and wine both have a little more acid in them, a little bit lower pH, so that a lot of different liners will break down a little more quickly with cider than they will with beer or even some wines. So it doesn't really last as well. Where glass won't break down. I mean, you don't worry about the oxidation because it's already oxidized. Pretty fantastic container.
I've had 5-year-old brew in bottles. Absolutely delicious. Somebody comes here, they want to sit and sample. How do you suggest that they grow their cider experience and actually, I guess, learn? We said the easiest way is to get the liquid across your lips.
Absolutely.
And what do you tell them? What should they be doing when they show up?
Brewed has been our flagship the last several years, and it's a variation off our original flagship, which was Red Streak.
Okay.
A dry English-style cider. This is a dry, we like the big Michigan-style cider. Yeah.
Delicious.
We're certainly influenced by England and France and Spain and Austria and everywhere that makes cider. But we're making our own cider now, and we're pretty proud of that. So start with brut because it is dry, it has got apple, it has got some barrel, doesn't have a lot of sweetness because it's fermented dry. It's actually got no residual sugar.
I was going to say, the sugar piece is big for ciders in general.
Yeah, so we don't have to do anything special to it. The yeast just ferments it out. All the sugar in apple juice is fermentable. Typically will ferment all the way down. So in England, you'll see typically farms that make farmhouse cider will have 3 different ciders. They'll have dry, they'll have medium, which is kind of their off-dry, has a little bit of residual sugar left that the yeast didn't quite finish up. A little more body, a little more apple character, just about the best. And then they have sweet. And sweet, what they typically do is they'll add some sugar back to the dry cider to give it more sweetness. And they can do that either with sugar, table sugar, or they can do that with honey, or they can do that with, best of all, apple juice. So if you put more apple juice in for the fermented cider, after the yeast is removed, you get that sweetness and a lot more apple flavor in the cider.
Cool. This lineup is here all the time.
Yeah.
Plus there's a selection of draft, right? Above and beyond.
Yes.
Those are small batch, usually.
Yeah, now we typically, so everything we're doing now, a lot of people that have had Virtue Cider probably had it on draft in a bar or a restaurant, or maybe they had it in cans. We don't do cans anymore because we found that while cans are very popular, our cider doesn't taste as good to the cider makers in a can as it does in the bottle. We think draft tastes fantastic, but the very best is in the bottle. Yeah, we do a frosé. So we'll take our rosé you've got down there at that end here.
Yep.
And here's our
Pretty
rosé.
Pretty look, yeah. Pretty. Absolutely.
So ours is a botanical rosé. First time we made a rosé, we actually used the Creek cherries. So Seth Bovey, our cider maker, has been with us. It'll be 10 years end of the summer. When we made our first batch of Creek and we took the cider off the cherries, he's like, Greg, come smell the cherries. They still smell great. I think we can get another batch out of it. So we put another batch of cider on those used cherries. And, you know, we're thrifty. You know, farmers are thrifty. We want to get every bit we can out of it.
Yep.
So we put the cider back on there, and, you know, lo and behold, it wasn't anything like the creek. It was a beautiful pink hue, and boy, it was fantastic. So we bottled that. We called it a rosé. We had everybody that came to the farm that summer. It seemed like everybody tasted it and said, "Okay, this is my favorite thing I've ever tasted in my life. You guys should make this all the time and commercially offer it available." And we're like, well, we only have 37 trees. So, and there aren't there's no one else growing these Chardonnay cherries anywhere around here. So I said, okay, well, we'll try it with other cherries. And we did. It was good, but it wasn't up to our standard. About the same time, we've been playing around with botanicals, too. We'd love to make a botanical cider, doing a rosé with botanicals. So the first step was tasting many cases of rosé wine and doing tasting notes. So we did our little tasting notes on, as we do with all our ciders, on all these different rosé wines, and then we looked at the flavors we liked the most in those rosé wines and say, okay, how did we get those in a cider? And a lot of them were herbal, some of them were fruity and citrusy, there's a little bit of tannin in there. So we said, how do we get all those? And we went to our friends down the road at Calsec, Kalamazoo Spice Extract Company, which had its origins in the Todd family, who grew out of the peppermint for Wrigley. Lo and behold, the Todd farm about a mile down the road.
And you might want to explain what a botanical is to somebody.
Yeah, so botanicals are things that grow. Typically, you'll use as a blend, almost to make a tea-like thing to get the flavor out of it. So tea would be considered a botanical. Probably the best known botanical beverage is gin. It's made with a whole range of different botanicals.
Yeah, sure.
To flavor what starts out more or less as vodka, but then you put in your juniper and your mints and all your different things. So we said, let's do a botanical cider. Wouldn't that be fun? So we went to our friends at Calsec and said, okay, here's what we want to do. We want all these flavors in our cider. So you guys put blends together of the botanicals that we want flavors of, and let's see if we can come up with a match. It took us about a year, longer than we expected, but we wanted to get it right. It didn't taste as much like botanicals as it tasted like rosé, and that's exactly what we wanted.
I know I've drunk a lot of this, but very much like rosé wine, right? There's no, basically not a whole lot of difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, you get notes of citrus, you get notes of like, there's no strawberries in it, but you get strawberry in the nose.
Hot summer day. It's absolutely delicious.
A little twinkle of mint and thyme and some other herbs, a little bit of tannin. It is, it's been our best-selling cider in the summer since the first year we brought it out.
Yeah. Anything else that people need to know about coming here? How often do they get to see you?
More and more. I live up here now.
And I know we talked a lot about coming up here or whatever, but this is open year-round, and there's fire pits in the wintertime. It's a wonderful place. We live in a cold environment, and there's no reason in the world not to enjoy it either.
That we think is pretty cool, is that when you come up here, you get to experience, Michigan farm life, because we wanted to not just be a cider factory on a piece of land. We wanted to be a farm. We have apples that we grow here. You can see the orchards. You can walk through the orchards. They're still only 10 years old, which is babies for an orchard. Also, you come up here and there's orchards all around the tour. We're also in the Fennville AVA. AVA is American Viticultural Area, typically of winemaking. They do in the U.S. too, and the second one in the whole country was Fennville. Napa was third. So it is a very unique unique wine area. We have a winery right next to us.
Right, can see it
called
from here.
Medalles,
Yep.
which makes fantastic wine. And I don't mean fantastic wine for Michigan. I mean fantastic wine.
Okay.
Andrew, the winemaker there, is from Napa originally, or Sonoma rather. So we've got over a dozen wineries in the Fennville AVA. We've got like 5 cider makers. We have a couple breweries. We have cheesemakers. So, you know, if you always want to go out to the Napa Valley and you live in the Midwest or the Great Lakes, come here. But when you come to our farm, you know, we've also got, you can hear the birds chirping probably right now. We got all kinds of wildlife. We got wild turkeys running around. You'll see deer once in a while. If you're lucky, maybe a pair of coyotes running off in the distance.
Still have our Gloucestershire spotted pigs.
Yep, we've got traditional English pigs, the Gloucestershire Old Spot, which we named cider for.
Yep, delicious.
So it is a very big pig that has black spots all over it, and the legend goes in England that those spots are from apples falling on their backs, because they're also known as the orchard pig.
Well, Greg, I can't thank you enough for your time, the insight, the stories. I think it's just great stuff. And people, if you know, we're, what, 2.5 hours maybe from Chicago, very easy ride, and it's gorgeous. There's nothing better than a afternoon sitting out here, one of these tables, and enjoying cold cider and enjoying the total atmosphere of what Virtue Cider delivers. So,
Yeah, about an hour from Grand Rapids
There you go.
in South Bend, about 2 hours from Chicago, about 3 hours from Detroit Rock City.
yeah. So, Greg, let's real quickly, let's talk about the sustainability of what the Virtue is. I know you've got a huge solar array field, and I think that's producing all or most of your electrical needs.
Well, you know, in the summer, it's pretty much all. In the winter, days aren't long enough for all of it, so we're still attached to the grid. But yeah, that was one of the plans from the very start, was to make the most interesting range of ciders we can make here at Virtue, using very traditional methods, practices, and do it as sustainably as possible. Cider was made sustainably for thousands of years when there was no choice. You have cider mills that basically, you know, you're getting fruit from your farm that's grown with basically sunlight and water. Yeah, but no fertilizing, you know, not even irrigation. And then they would run their mill either with horsepower, a horse, or sometimes they'd have a river that turned a water wheel that would turn everything. So, I mean, it was basically no energy from anything other than nature. Aged in barrels, you know, so basically it's all about trees. You get the fruit from a tree, you know, you press it, and then you put it in another tree.
Yeah.
You go from the apple tree to the oak.
Yep.
You know, we still follow those traditions, and we're trying to get back away from that and going to as much solar power as we can. So in the summer, as we said, spring, summer, early fall, it's almost all solar power. And then hoping this year to add chargers, car chargers.
Well, you're also, with the cider house too, the cellar, right?
Absolutely. Every time we hire new cider makers, usually from breweries, they're like, how do you cool the tanks? And we're like, we don't cool the tanks. They're at cellar temperature. We're like, oh, how do you cool the cellar? We don't cool the cellar. The cellar stays cool because it's underground.
Thank you. Thanks for your time,
Cheers.
and all the best.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview, and will join us again for the next segment of Under the Apple Tree with Bob Kenny, where we visit another one of our great American cideries. Don't forget to like the channel and subscribe. Cheers.